From Sabrina the Teenage Witch to Bugs Bunny cartoons, Satan images are everywhere in our culture. But how well does our common image of Satan match up with the Bible and with history? Because for all of its prevalence, the concept of Satan has probably evolved more over time than any other. And if we divide the Bible into time periods, that fact becomes very clear. So let's do that. Now, we can divide biblical history into periods of time. First, when the stories were passed down verbally, then the stories began to be written down during the time of the kings of Israel. But when Israel was destroyed and Judah taken into exile, another shift in writing occurred, which we find in the very last books of the Old Testament to be written, but which continued through the period between the Old and New Testaments. Finally, we have the New Testament era itself, about a 50-year period when our entire New Testament was written. Now, if you take all of the references to Satan in the Bible and roughly put them on this timeline, something rather startling happens. There are no references to a Satan figure at all in the early scriptures. Not a one. Now, I know we are used to reading Satan backwards into the stories, but he isn't there. Satan is not mentioned as being in the Garden of Eden, just a snake. In the early books, it isn't Satan who turns people away. It is God. God hardened Pharaoh's heart, for instance, not Satan like we might expect. Because the early believers saw God as the ultimate author of everything, completely in charge. There was no room for any other figure. God sent both the good and the bad. But this isn't to say that the word Satan did not appear. Indeed, the term Satan literally is Hebrew for adversary, and it does appear in the first books of the Bible, but as normal accusers or adversaries, not a demon. In 1 Samuel, the Philistine kings sent David away from battle, afraid that he would be a Satan to them if he stayed, an opponent to stand in their way. In 1 Kings, God raises up a Satan against Solomon, a mortal man to oppose him. In fact, the only non-human presence is about an angel of the Lord who stands against Balaam in the book of Numbers as a Satan to him, as someone who stands against him. That's it. There is no demonic figure at all. Instead, God was seen as rewarding those who followed and cursing those who rebelled. However, this idea over time got challenged. The Israelites were being hammered by their enemies and they couldn't explain it. At first, it was because they had failed to follow God, but then why were all of these evil people succeeding? Why would God reward those people and not God's people? What they came up with was the notion of deferred reward and punishment. Instead of saying that God in this life rewards the righteous and punishes the unrighteous, they transferred their beliefs so that in the end everyone would be judged for what they did, and rewards and punishments would come then. Now, this was a big change from the immediate rewards that the early scriptures had promised, and it brought with it something else, a courtroom image, where God is judge and your deeds are put on trial. Meaning that there has to be someone to accuse you, a prosecutor, or in Hebrew, a Satan. Now, this is the first appearance of Satan, not as an enemy of God, but as a prosecuting attorney working for God. And it is in this role that we see Satan appear in Job, a respected member of the heavenly court doing his job as God weighs judgment. But all power still resided with God. The decision of whether this should happen or not still resided with God. And it's that same role that we see Satan in Zechariah. However, as people's suffering continued, they needed more of an explanation, and the accuser got a more active role. Instead of simply making the case before God, the accuser began to have power by itself to affect people. We see this in one of the very last books of the Old Testament to be written, Chronicles, where Satan is seen as moving David to take a wrongful census of the people. Now, this is the only time Satan is a figure acting on his own in the entire Old Testament. And it changes that same story that we find in 2 Samuel, when it is God that is said to have inspired David, an idea that was no longer palatable to the people. But what about Lucifer, I hear you ask? Well, Lucifer doesn't exist. One passage in Isaiah talks about a morning star being cast to the ground from heaven because it sought to rise above God. But this has nothing to do with Satan. It specifically says that is addressed to the king of Babylon. It is a poetic description of his empire being destroyed. It says that only a few verses earlier. A similar passage in Ezekiel is likewise addressed explicitly to the king of Tyre, only a few verses earlier. In context, it is quite clear that both are addressed to real physical people talking about their downfall. But we ignore this because the Latin for morning star, i.e. the planet Venus that we can see shining in the pre-dawn light, is Lucifer. It's just Latin. And we know it's not a name for some supernatural evil because 2 Peter talks about Jesus being the morning star, the Lucifer rising in our hearts. It's not a name. And it was only popularized as a name for Satan in his angelic form in the 1600s by Milton's Paradise Lost. Satan, as a supernatural figure of evil, does not exist in the Old Testament. We can see the roots of the idea and the problems that drove people to look for a cause of evil outside of God, but the idea itself only really flowered in the time between the Old and New Testaments. Whether its rise was as a result of God's continual unveiling of truth, or whether it was an easy solution to a troubling theological problem, has been hotly debated. But part of Satan's rise came because the people in exile had encountered an alternative to one God causing both good and evil. Zoroastrianism was rising in Persia during the time of the Babylonian captivity, and that exposed the people of God to a dualistic view of the universe, where good and evil are engaged in an eternal struggle. Here the Israelites for the first time encountered the ideas of both a heaven and a hell waiting for people, with a single good God, but also a father of lies that brought death to the world and wars against the good God as the personification of all evil. This was a new idea, but they latched onto it, because to a people struggling to understand why God wasn't acting to stop their pain, this was incredibly appealing. And many of these concepts blossomed soon after God's people were exposed to them. It is in that intertestamental period that we see the snake of the Garden of Eden take on the added weight of also being Satan. It is this time period that elevated the prosecuting attorney for God into a full-fledged enemy of God, a fallen angel at war with heaven. Many names for this being were used, but during that time period, Belial was actually the most common one, becoming the leader of an army of fallen angels, and even seeming to be the opposite of God. Throughout this era, a dualism began growing, a belief that in order to make sense of the horror of this world, there has to be an opposite power stopping God from accomplishing all of the good things promised. Eventually, this led to Belial being seen as the ruler of this world and in control of death itself. And as we see how often they talked about it, the people obsessed over this new idea. But if all of this seems like wildly out of control speculation and syncretism, well, it is. But by the time of the New Testament, large portions of the Jewish population believed it. And while the faction of the Sadducees rejected it all, heaven, hell, angels, demons, Satan's the work, Jesus had very little to do with them, intentionally aligning himself more with the radical Pharisees, who he disagreed with about practice, but not beliefs. Indeed, the New Testament quotes many of those intertestamental inventions, talking about Satan as the one who has the power over death, the prince of this world, and assumes that Satan is a fallen angel. On the surface, it seems like the New Testament accepts all of that Satan imagery without thought. But there are two crucial changes that the New Testament makes to the cultural understanding of Satan. First, it is not dualism. Yes, Satan fights against God in the New Testament, but is nowhere near of equal power. In fact, the New Testament, rather than reinforce the intertestamental ideas of how powerful Satan is, regularly emphasizes that he has almost no power over a believer. Which leads into the second change, that Satan is defeated. Instead of a battle that might go either way, the New Testament clearly makes the case that Satan is done. This isn't a legit battle. It's over. Even if he doesn't know it yet, it's over. He's lost. Now, this is not to say that the New Testament denies the existence of spiritual beings or adversaries to God. Quite the opposite. Just that rather than confront the incorrect assumptions of an entire culture, early Christians simply emphasized that it's not a fight among equals. It's not an issue. He's defeated. And from here, the Satan imagery dies out mostly for centuries, at times reclaiming some of the Old Testament elements of an accuser sitting next to God at the Last Judgment. Like this, one of the first images we have of Satan, where he's still looking quite angelic in form and performing a role. But then, as Christianity began to take over in the Roman world, the old Greek and Roman gods needed to be explained, and old virtues needed to be turned into vices. That these beings that you used to worship as God, they're actually demons. The god Pan was singled out as representing lust, depravity, and sin, and so Satan images began to look like Pan, with goat legs and small horns. A bident, a two-headed trident, was later added as a nod to Hades, god of the dead, to represent Satan's connection with, and soon believed power over, hell and death. Now, as time went on, bat wings came to symbolize the wings of fallen angels, and so came to represent Satan by the Middle Ages. And it is from those centuries that Satan really returns with vigor to the Christian mind. So the church in the 1200s was using the fear of hell to motivate people to behave on earth. Sounds fairly familiar. However, with the Black Death sweeping the land, it was becoming increasingly more difficult to convince people that anything could be worse than what they were experiencing. And so more and more vivid images of Satan were used, with graphic representations of the punishment awaiting for them. Punishment that by this time was seen as being administered by Satan himself. Dante, in his epic The Divine Comedy, is largely to blame for this change, as he is for so many of our ideas of hell. He saw Satan as a fallen angel cast to earth, who punched a hole into the center of it on impact, forming hell, a place where he rules. Now this is contrary to Scripture, where any hell is a place set aside as the place of Satan's imprisonment and torture, not his personal realm to rule from. But such vivid images were necessary to convince people that there were worse things than their own lives. And as such, Satan also began to increase again in perceived power, taking on the ability to actually work in the world in enormous ways, including by directly controlling people instead of just whispering to them. This new belief directly led to much of the witch hysteria that swept Christendom in the following centuries, a natural outgrowth of the new focus on Satan out in the world seeking people to control. Even today, Satan is often seen as the cause of all the ills of the world, the immortal opponent of God who rules hell like God rules heaven. And we each have to choose which one of them we're going to serve. But none of that is biblical. Instead, it is a natural growth as people struggle with the problem of evil, slowly rejecting the idea that God is the cause of both good and evil, and instead latching onto the idea that other beings, and eventually one other being, are working against God. Now, the Bible does not deny the existence of spiritual evil. Far from it. But nowhere is Satan equal to God, or even vaguely close. And he is defeated. It is pretty much certain that no biblical writer, especially Old Testament writer, would be able to recognize our modern version of Satan. And while some of that can be God continuing to reveal truth to us, one thing is crystal clear in Scripture. Whatever Satan is, he is not worth being paranoid over. He is beaten already. When we forget that Satan has been defeated, especially when we elevate him to a dualism that's not found in Scripture, we are drastically overplaying Satan's importance and underplaying what Jesus did on the cross. Hell is not envisioned as a place for him to rule, but a place for Satan to receive punishment. And that is what we'll be talking about next week. I hope you'll come back for it. In the meantime, if you want to check out a video looking closer at the time between the testaments, check out this video down here. And if you're jumping into the series near the end, you might want to check out this series from the very beginning, which you can find here. And as always, thank you for watching. Have a great week. See you next Friday.